Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Why We Love Graps. And today I am joined by Kate from Fightful and a million other things that she does. So, why don't we start this off with Kate? Tell us about yourself. What do you do? All that.
Sure. I am a wrestling podcaster and content creator. Most of my work is based out of Fightful, but I also do the Mark Order podcast, and I have my own YouTube channel that's really, honestly, just almost like a place for me to exercise and get to kind of give my thoughts on promotions that I don't cover. Because I'm sure as we get into this, we're going to talk about like just how many different presentations there are in wrestling right now. I'm very fortunate that I cover a lot of them most days of the week, but yeah, so that's kind of where I am. I was a public relations major at Seton Hall University and worked at our radio station before that, so I've kind of always had an interest in communications and radio and podcasting being so connected is kind of a natural point for me to blend something I'm very passionate about with another thing that I'm really passionate about. That's kind of what I always liked about communications is it's like, oh, I get to blend my love for communications with another thing is something that's always attracted me to that. But yeah, and then I'm based out of the Northeast, have a cool dog in a nice apartment, hanging out, living the dream.
Yeah, let's go into wrestling a little bit and start breaking this down. So,
Sure.
what are your first, earliest memories of wrestling? Everybody has, Sean. I interviewed Sean Ross Sapp from Fightful, and his was he didn't really remember. He just remembers Sting, Great Muta, and Ric Flair. And for me, I just remember going to a random Raw in 2008, 2009 type time span. I just remember John Cena. So for you, what are those earliest memories you have?
It's very funny that you started watching in 08 and 09 because I'm going to expose myself for how much older I am than you, young Kaden. But I actually started watching in 09 as well. And it's funny because I'm sure you hear this too all the time that's largely regarded as a time that was really not great in wrestling. And now that I've watched more and learned more, I understand why people think that. But I was so fascinated off the bat by a few things. The first thing that I really remember, like earliest memories of something that grabbed me, was a short-lived faction called Legacy. I'm sure you remember if you were watching around the same time. But it was kind of the first inkling that I got of like, oh, this is a real art form, because it was this wrestling stable led by Randy Orton, and they were all second generation wrestlers, and they all had very different single personalities, but they all had this shared common thread. And I remember just seeing, I think Randy Orton was probably the first heel that I saw, and I was just so incensed by like, you can't just go and break the rules like that. Like, he pulled so many emotional reactions out of me that I started to get really into it. Was probably the first thing I remember. And then I kind of had one foot out the door in 2011 when the CM Punk pipe bomb happened. I just remember gravitating to heels or bad guys. I don't know how much your audience is going to know about wrestling lingo, but there's bad guys and there's good guys, right? And I always gravitated toward the bad guys because I just always felt like there was so much more intrigue there as far as layered characters and approaches to things. And they would just all keep losing to John Cena. And I was like, well, I don't want to keep watching this if all my favorites are losing to the same guy in the same way every time. And then because I wasn't watching in the Stone Cold era or before, CM Punk delivered his famous pipe bomb promo, right? And it was the first time anybody had really broken the fourth wall. And I remember being like, holy cow. And I didn't know what shooting was that time or what a work was. Like I was still kind of getting acclimated to it. And also that was so intriguing to me because it genuinely felt at that time like one guy actually made a difference in the ecosystem that he was operating in. And I found that just tremendously cool. And it kind of made it can't miss because I was like, well, now I feel like anything can kind of happen at any time because I don't think they had plans for CM Punk to become the biggest force in wrestling at the time.
So you mentioned CM Punk. I feel like if you know Kate and if you talk to Kate, you can't not talk about Phil Brooks, CM Punk. How important is CM Punk to your love of professional wrestling? Not only just in 2011 when he cut that pipe bomb and really changed the wrestling industry. I don't think it's been the same ever since that day in June. But going back now, it's he's still such an important role, a pivotal role in the wrestling world. So how is that and with your love of wrestling?
He is single-handedly responsible for my love of wrestling in a lot of ways. The first is in that promo, he said the names of New Japan and Ring of Honor, which were things that I didn't know existed until that promo. And it made me realize as a fan that there were other promotions out there and other presentations of this out there. And I, not to sound whatever, but like tend to be with any art form intellectually curious about things. When I listen to music, it's not just what's on the radio right now. I don't assume that the best of an art form is what's most readily accessible to me and what's most current, though sometimes it is. Sometimes there's really great stuff that's happening right now and right on your television. So just making me realize that there's a whole environment that I hadn't really seen before was something that happened just from him dropping those names in that promo. And that changed my purview as a fan entirely. And he was the first guy, I'll put it this way, I have the Chicago Stars tattooed on my neck and I ain't from Chicago. Like, it's because of him. And I was it's like the right wrestler in the right place at the right time for where you are emotionally is what happened right there. I was coming out of, on a very personal level, like a decade of trauma. And I was kind of just connecting to this idea that you could be a survivor of it and not a victim of it, and kind of leaning into now what I feel like is a much healthier mindset than I was in. And this guy is coming out railing against his boss, wearing PMA shirts on television. I was like, what the heck is PMA? Positive mental attitude, which is an ethos from 80s punk rock, which just basically says that you're in charge of your own happiness, is I guess a quick way to sum that up. And so he was so important to me, not only in my wrestling fandom, but genuinely me as a person. And that will always mean so much to me because any art form at its best is that, right? It's an exploration of you, or I think Chuck Klosterman defined art as like seeing yourself reflected in something that isn't you. I feel that way about music. I feel that way about certain movies and television shows. I feel that way about wrestling as well in this case. And now it's very funny because he was gone for 7 years and he came back. And in that time, he's one of my favorite wrestlers. He's one of my favorite storytellers. My appreciation for him grew because he left, but I didn't, and I stayed in wrestling, and I'd seen. I got smarter as a fan, and I started to pick up more nuances, and I started to understand the art form more. And when he came back, there were so many things about the way that he told stories that I was just like, man, it feels so good to have him back, because sometimes you outgrow certain artists. And I was like, what if he comes back and I'm so psyched and I think it sucks? Like, I'd be so bummed. But it actually, as a smarter fan, made me appreciate the little nuances that he carried so much more. And sometimes the presentations haven't been for me with him in the more recent landscape. I just think he's the best bad guy. Like, he should be a heel, and his whole return, he's been a face pretty much. Good guy. So there's things like that, but man, when you get down to it, he's just one of my favorite American style wrestlers of all time. And I'll always be a fan of his work, despite some of the personality conflicts that have come up in more recent years.
Yeah, like one of the common themes that's come up so far is the level of escapism in wrestling and how everybody has used it to get through something in their life. And for me personally, I also have a very deep connection to CM Punk. I had a very traumatic experience in 2018, and I delved deep into wrestling. And my love of Punk and how I got into him is a little different because he was out of the wrestling scene. I didn't get into him when he was in 2011 at the height of his power in WWE. It was somebody who fans had been speculating for 4 years at that point on if he would return. And that was my experience of I got into the idea of like, is he going to return? And I followed that, this sense of hope kind of, if
Yeah.
that makes sense. You know, like as somebody going through something, you kind of need this hope, this not really Superman figure, but something like that. I guess it is Superman because the S stands for hope, and that's what Punk was for me. So it's awesome that everybody at least that I've talked to, and I think it's a little bit anecdotal, but also everybody I know who loves wrestling, there's something emotional that connects us all to it in some way or another.
And I think if you tell the average person that you like wrestling, they say, "Oh, like The Rock?" or
Mhm.
whatever, which is fair. And if you call it an art form to someone who doesn't watch wrestling, I think a lot of people have this extremely cheesy idea in their head, which it definitely can be that. It
Mhm.
certainly can be. Um, but at the end of the day, wrestling is a form of storytelling, and storytelling is a core principle of an art form. So when you know people that have been affected by it or are immersed in it, there is a kinship there, whether it's with
Yeah.
your favorites or not. Like um, the late Bray Wyatt, who was a master at the alley that he carved out in wrestling. His stuff largely wasn't for me, but for the people it was
Mhm.
for, it was the most that it was for. I'm so appreciative and find so much value in his work that even if it wasn't for me, because even just explain to people that there's different genres of wrestling isn't something most people have calculated.
Mhm.
So I love one thing I love so much about wrestling is that there's all these different entryways and avenues and presentations that you can get into. And it's in ring, it's promos, it's entrances, it's gear, it's all of these different elements, and everybody can find something to tap into to different pieces of it. And that's just like very, very beautiful to me because there are artists that I don't listen to that other people loved and that it saved their lives. Right. Like,
Mhm.
so that's some of the best part of it is um that there's all these entryways. You and I have look at what you just said. Like we have the same guy in completely different avenues to our emotional
Mhm.
connection to him. And then you take that and you expand it across the whole wrestling industry. It can be a really, really powerful force. So it's awesome.
Mhm.
Made friends that way.
100%. And you mentioned the different genres of wrestling. Now, we all have something. We all have that one genre that really speaks to us. And another similarity we have is that we have that same genre, the techers.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk a little bit about, for people who don't know, explain what a techer is, what that type of wrestling is, and why do you love it so much? Because I know what I love it. I'm interested in why you love it.
So Tecker is um well before we even start there, let me just say that like I was not in love with technical wrestling or the Techers from the beginning. I
Mhm.
think it's really important to allow yourself as a fan the space and the breathing room to develop different tastes, and as things change and the more you get educated and the more you watch, to have different preferences because um my favorite wrestler of 2023, I was not quiet about it, was the best technical wrestler in the world, the greatest techer that there is, Zack Sabre Jr. And if you showed me him at the beginning of my wrestling fandom, I would have been like, this guy changes holds every 6 seconds. His ADD is worse than mine. Like, what is happening here? But when you get really into the art form of it and you start to fall in love with that presentation of it, something that I love so much about technical wrestling is there's a lot. Um, but this idea that the story happens purely in the ring and the efficiency with which it unfolds, and with that, um, how much of the story is just the art form itself is like the most beautiful thing in the world to me. It really is because um, I brought up Zach. This is a really good example. I think that can maybe help people translate a little bit. He had a title reign where the belt he had was a stipulation of 15-minute matches. If you can't beat Zack Sabre Jr. in 15 minutes, you can't win. But the character that he was, the type of champion that he was, is that's not a victory. Outlasting someone is not a victory. I have to beat these guys in 15 minutes.
Mhm.
And to me, that caused some of the most creative technical wrestling match endings that you will ever see because you put this constraint on one of the most unbridled forms of professional wrestling. And usually, those stories that are told by technical wrestling take time to develop. And now it's it's been hastened. So this idea of like, I'm going to attack that guy's arm the entire match. Now you only have 15 minutes. Maybe you didn't really get around to telling that story, but you have to expedite the endings because you're a proud fighting champion is something that is just so interesting to me. But at the end of the day, my favorite thing about technical wrestling is that it just feels like every move that is made is geared toward actually winning a wrestling match. And I'm so appreciative of the acrobatics of lucha style, and I love American presentation where you have a little bit more of, as Chris Hero identified it, you have a little bit of like a moral struggle. The mental and physical chess game of technical wrestling is right now what I'm just the most in love with, because the easiest way for me to buy into a scripted story that is physical combat is for every move to look like you're trying to win a match and hurt your opponent. That's the beauty of techers to me. It's become my favorite thing, and the more that I've gotten to study over the past year, it just is to me the purest form of my favorite art form. Really,
Yeah, that's incredibly well put. I think technical wrestling is it truly is an art form, and all of wrestling is an art form. But when I watch a match like Zack Sabre Jr. versus Bryan Danielson, both matches, I just did like a whole breakdown of their first one a few weeks ago. You see how they make sure every single, like you said, every single move matters and everything flows correctly from one move to another to make sure it makes sense. It adds another sense of realism that, while I love lucha wrestling and I love, I'm trying to like, I love John Cena and CM Punk 2011 Money in the Bank. I love a
yes.
Kenny Omega match, Kenny and Hangman Page. I
HBK
love,
versus Taker, like one of the
yeah,
greatest WrestleMania matches of all time.
yeah. There's amazing wrestling out there, but I think the way that technical wrestlers tell their style, tell their story, and showcase their style just makes it like feel a little bit more real than the other ones.
100%. And to me, this is going to be very pretentious for your project. I just want you to know, but I'm a classically trained vocalist, and so technique is something that I, as the ethos of my singing, has been something that's very important to me. And I know how many times I have come across stumbling blocks and had to break through them, and how much like the only way to get better is through hard work and all of these things. And the reason that you put all this effort into mastering your technique is so that the story can take over. And what's really incredible, especially you and I know that there's a thing called calling it in the ring, which means you basically don't really plan your spots. You're just improvising with your partner. But when you master your technique on the level that Zack Sabre Jr. and Bryan Danielson have, as you called back to the greatest technical wrestling matches I've ever seen and made me cry. The spots are incredible and the technique is incredible, but there's this thing that happens when you are a master of the technique of your craft, whether you're a musician, an actor, wrestler, whatever, that because your technique is so ingrained into your identity, it is on autopilot. If I'm on my computer and whatever the heck .exe is running, I don't have to think about that, right? I just go surf the web. There's all these systems that are running. And that's kind of what technique as an artist is like. You have it so ingrained in your system that you don't really have to proactively think about it. You just get to be in the story in a more organic way than anybody could ever possibly be, because you know it's there and you can trust it and you've perfected it. There's some great wrestling matches where I can see people being like, okay, I'm going to do this next. You can read it across their face, right?
Yeah.
And it also allows for innovations. Like the reason I'm so blown away by Zack Sabre Jr. is he's doing things I've never seen in wrestling before. And I've watched years of wrestling. There's not a lot I haven't seen before that has to do with wrestling moves and not like a stunt spot or a deathmatch spot or any of these things. Like just pure wrestling. He is inventing stuff because he's already mastered every other submission, right? So just the artistic appreciation for what goes into mastering your technique, and also the way that allows artists to be in touch with the story in the most organic level possible is something that I think is just so special and drastically underrated. And I feel like those conversations are being pushed back into the modern wrestling landscape a lot more. And it just makes me so happy as an artistic purist in that regard.
Yeah. So I want to go to something a little not really different, but you mentioned CM Punk. You've mentioned Zack Sabre Jr. Bryan Danielson got mentioned a little bit in there,
Sure.
who I think is the greatest wrestler of all time.
You're right.
Who are I want so right now, like right today, three wrestlers who maybe they're not the greatest, maybe they're not the best, not the most technically sound, not the world champion, whatever, but three wrestlers who you just love to watch right now today.
Um, this is actually kind of funny because I feel like they are probably a lot of the people that are in the best in the world conversation. Zach is right now, to me, doing the best work of anybody in wrestling that
Mhm.
aligns with my proclivities and taste as a wrestling fan.
Yeah.
Um, I compared his last title reign to End of the Rope by The Clash, and that I think um, it was a transitional thing that's going to set up London Calling. Like, I think his title reign, when he wins the big one, is going to be a sight to see in 2024. I'm hoping that's where we're going. New Japan not off to a great start with that, but there's never a match where I am like, that was only medium with that guy. Like, he's right now incredible. Will Ospreay is also just so phenomenal at probably the best well-rounded wrestler in his prime in the game right now.
Mhm.
Um, I am an average match for him on a work rate level is just so high, and I feel like kind of clears pretty much everybody else in wrestling. Um, that I'm fascinated by what he's able to do with an average rep and how special he makes them all feel from a story and an in-ring perspective. And he's just also in his wrestling prime, which is something special.
Mhm.
Um, Danielson's too easy, and we already mentioned it. I want to give somebody that's like a little bit more off the beaten path. I'll say Sami Zayn. There are
Yeah.
some people that just, no matter what they do, can pull a certain emotional appeal out of it. And Sami Zayn for me
Mhm.
is one of those guys. I feel like there is a trope in WWE that has been so run into the ground that it's hard for me to find appeal in it, of the underdog babyface, and the way that they are portrayed and the way that they are presented in matches is so repetitive and rinse, lather, repeat. Lather, rinse, repeat. Don't do that. Don't do what I said. You'll be all out of order with your laundry cycles. But he, as an underdog babyface, for whatever reason, there's just some wrestlers you get connected to. I'm just always rooting for that guy, even in times where the story is set up for me not to be rooting for that guy. I'm
Mhm.
always rooting for that guy, and he just has this authenticity that shows up in every word he says, every move he makes in the ring, his facial expressions. Um, I just am such a fan of that guy's work, and seeing him genuinely kind of break out in the past 2-3 years has been such a delight for me, because I've always felt like that guy was in there, and now he kind of has the magnifying glass on him to prove it. So, but you're right that Bryan Danielson's the best wrestler of all time, and he's doing some of the best work of his
Yeah.
career. It's just too obvious.
I'm glad you brought up Sami Zayn because we talked a little bit earlier with Punk about the emotional investment of wrestling. And for me, for people who don't know, Sami Zayn is Muslim, and that's not really common in wrestling. It is much more now with him and Mustafa Ali and Mansoor. So we're getting some representation. But as someone from of Muslim heritage, getting to see him on the big stage, and then also I had the opportunity to be ringside or on the floor at WrestleMania last year when he was in the main event of WrestleMania and he won the tag titles in the main event of WrestleMania. Getting to see that representation, it's a whole other level of wrestling besides just the emotional attachment that you have, but also if you are somebody from a culture or race, religion that is underrepresented in media in the United States in general, in Western culture, it's really awesome that wrestling is a place for that. And it was not, honestly, to be perfectly clear. Like, it just wasn't for such a long time. Muslims would get the most stereotypical characters possible.
Yeah.
And to be in an era now where you're seeing them win the big belts, get the big wins, get the big stage, get the push of the company, it's awesome to see.
it is really special that we're in a time where there's so much more awareness around, and there's still plenty of ways to go, but
Yes.
there's a lot more awareness and um, diversity within representation, or
Mhm.
representation within diversity rather, that Sami Zayn and Mustafa Ali don't need to be represented cartoonishly as the same way. And
Mhm.
um, there was a trope for a very long time, especially in the 80s and 90s, of big bad foreign heel, good American. Thank you, Hulk Hogan, for opening that door. He was incredible at it,
Yeah.
right? But there is, like with art forms in general, is supposed to be a social progression in the way that
Mhm.
things are represented on screen. And there have been plenty of times where that has caused certain backlash. And it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a lot to see the importance of that representation. It takes one video of a young Black girl doing Bianca Belair's entrance to understand why representation is so important. And it's that thing of, if it's possible for someone that looks like me or has my background or is my gender or whatever, if it's possible for them, it's possible for me. So it's something that I think was lost for a really long time. And because the, there's this idea in wrestling that your character is yourself turned up to 11. And for Stone Cold Steve Austin, that means something entirely different than somebody that comes from a not straight white American male background, and how
Mhm.
that gets perceived on television. If you are Asian, you are the most Asian. If you're a straight white guy, you just get to have who you are as a personality turned up. But if you're different, that's the only aspect that we amplify, is a really dangerous and um unfair to an artist thing that you could handcuff them with, I think,
Mhm.
because they should get to be in control of how they choose to represent themselves. So I'm very glad that we have seen a tremendous amount of progress. There's still a tremendous amount of progress to be made.
Yeah.
If you think about how many Indian people there are in the world and how many of them are on television, there's a huge gap there. Like Rohit Raju should have a TV contract, for example, things like that. So it is very cool that you've had that experience. And I, on the women's side, have seen a ton more advocacy and pressure put on promotions. I'm very loud about that on on my social media and on my shows. So it's a really important aspect. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because when we're talking about emotional investment and connection, that's a big piece of it, is that person is like me in some way.
Mhm. Yeah. So as we wind this down, I'm going to ask you one more question,
Sure.
but there's a stipulation.
Oh
Just like
no.
wrestling, there's a
Is
stipulation.
it 2 out of 3 falls? What are we
You,
doing?
you can only answer this question with one word.
Oh God.
You can use hyphens if you need to cheat. That's what Ella J did. She cheated a little bit. And Sean gave me a whole paragraph for his answer, so people are not adhering to my rules. But I'm going to ask you, it's the title of this show. Why do you love Graps?
Can I give you one phrase? I'll still be better than Sean.
I'll take a phrase. Yeah. There's
Emo-
wrestling. You bend the rules.
Emotional connection, honestly.
Yeah.
Like that's the I was trying to think if there was a pithier way to say that, but authenticity is probably the closest one word answer I can give. If I'm being good, if I'm following the rules, if I'm a baby face and I'm actually doing what I'm told, authenticity, I think, is the thing that opens the door to the emotional connection. So
Yeah.
when artists get to portray themselves in an authentic way on such a platform, that's what opens or primes the pump for people to become emotionally connected to them. The actual thing is the emotional connection.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. That's
There you
probably the
go.
word I would choose too. Or
I gave you a
phrase.
baby face and a heel answer. I bent the rules and I followed the rules. So
It's that's the most wrestling thing to do.
right,
You follow the rules, but then you gotta bend them a little bit. Nobody ever
right.
truly follows the rules in pro wrestling. Well, Kate, thank you so much for
Of
joining me on
course.
this episode of Why We Love Graps.
Thank you for giving me a place to talk about it. It made me very
Yeah,
happy. And I love that you young people are having evolved conversations about what an awesome art form this is. It's very
it
cool.
is. It's a fantastic art form. And thank you everybody who's watching.